You step outside your front door, and there is no street, no sidewalk, no driveway, just water, lapping quietly against stone steps that lead straight down into a canal. If you want to go anywhere, you don't walk, you climb into a boat. This isn't a fantasy. This is a real city, built by real people over 1,000 years ago, and it still stands today, sinking by millimeters every year, but somehow still standing. How do you build a city with no roads at all? And more strangely, why would anyone choose to? Rewind to the 5th century. The Roman Empire is collapsing. Waves of invaders, the Huns, the Goths, the Lombards, are sweeping across northern Italy, burning towns and seizing land. The people living along the mainland coast face an impossible choice: stay and risk everything, or run somewhere no army would ever bother following. They chose the second option, and the place they ran to was almost absurd. A scattering of muddy, marshy islands in a shallow lagoon, unfit for farming, unfit for grazing, barely fit for standing on. But that was exactly the point. No cavalry could charge across open water. No siege engine could roll through a swamp. The very uselessness of the land became its greatest defense. Here's the problem nobody could avoid. You cannot build a city on mud. Solid stone buildings, packed close together, weighing thousands of tons, would simply sink into soft lagoon sediment and disappear. So the early Venetians did something almost unbelievable. They drove wooden piles, tree trunks really, straight down through the mud, thousands of them, packed so tightly beneath a single building that some structures rest on more than 100,000 individual piles. Alder wood was the material of choice, cut from forests along the mainland and floated down rivers to the lagoon. Why alder? Why not oak or something sturdier? This is where the real secret of Venice hides, and it isn't in the wood itself. It's in the mud. Wood normally rots when exposed to oxygen and bacteria. But drive a wooden pile deep enough into oxygen-starved, waterlogged lagoon sediment, and something strange happens. The wood doesn't decay. Instead, minerals in the water slowly infiltrate the wood fibers, and over centuries, the timber essentially petrifies. It hardens. Geologists studying Venice's foundations, including researchers affiliated with Italy's National Research Council, have examined pile samples pulled from beneath the city's oldest buildings and found wood that has remained structurally intact for over 1,000 years. Its cellular structure gradually mineralized by the very environment that should have destroyed it. The mud that seemed like Venice's greatest weakness turned out to be its foundation's best-kept secret. On top of these petrified forests, builders laid horizontal wooden platforms, then slabs of Istrian stone, a dense, white limestone resistant to water erosion, and only then did the marble palaces and brick churches rise. Every building you see in photographs of Venice, every ornate rooftop, every bell tower, is quietly floating on a foundation that used to be a tree. But the piles solved only half the puzzle. What about getting around? A city with no roads still needs a way to move people, goods, and armies. The answer was already surrounding them. Instead of filling in the water to make land, the Venetians built around it, embracing the canals as their street network. The Grand Canal became the city's central boulevard. Smaller canals branched off it like capillaries, and where canals didn't reach, narrow footbridges and pedestrian alleys, called calli, connected the gaps. Boats weren't a workaround. They were the primary infrastructure, the equivalent of every car, truck, and delivery van a modern city relies on. Historian John Julius Norwich, who spent decades chronicling Venice's political and cultural history, described the city's relationship with water as inseparable from its identity as a maritime republic, not because Venetians loved water for its own sake, but because water was the only medium flexible enough to let a landless people build an empire. And build an empire they did. By the 13th century, Venice controlled trade routes stretching from the eastern Mediterranean to the Adriatic coast, all administered from a city that, on paper, shouldn't have been able to support more than a small fishing village. Think about what that inversion means. Every other major city in history grew because of the strength of its ground. Rome had its 7 hills. Paris had its riverbanks. London had solid Thames-side clay. Venice had none of that. Its entire existence was a workaround, a defiant answer to a landscape that offered no advantages at all. And instead of losing to that landscape, the Venetians turned its worst feature, the mud, into a foundation, and its second worst feature, the water, into a highway. This is where the story gets stranger, because Venice's success bred its own vulnerability. The floating foundations that saved the city are the same ones slowly failing it today. Acqua Alta, the seasonal high tides that flood St. Mark's Square, have grown more frequent and more severe as sea levels rise and the city itself continues to subside, sinking an estimated 1 to 2 millimeters a year from the sheer weight resting on those ancient piles. Engineers now monitor Venice using satellite data and underwater sensors, technology the original builders could never have imagined, just to keep pace with a slow collapse that began the moment the first pile was driven into the mud over 1,000 years ago. You might wonder why anyone would build a city this fragile, this stubborn, this seemingly doomed from the start. But that's the wrong question. The right question is why it worked at all. A civilization looked at land that couldn't support a hut, water that couldn't be crossed on foot, and mud that should have swallowed anything built on top of it. And instead of retreating, engineered a solution so unlikely that it's still functioning more than a millennium later. They didn't fight the water. They didn't drain it, didn't pave over it, didn't pretend it wasn't there. They built with it, on it, and eventually because of it. You've probably never thought about the ground beneath your own house, the compacted soil, the poured concrete, the assumption that solid earth will simply hold you up without complaint. Venice never had that luxury. Every single building rests on a decision, made by someone 1,000 years ago, to trust rotting-resistant wood over solid stone, water over roads, and adaptation over conquest. It's easy to look at Venice today, the gondolas, the tourists, the postcard sunsets, and forget that the entire city is an act of defiance against physics. So the next time you walk down an ordinary street and never once think about whether the ground beneath you will hold, remember that somewhere in a lagoon on the Adriatic coast, an entire civilization refused to accept that a street was even necessary. There is still no road beneath Venice. There never was, just water, and the quiet, petrified forest holding it all up.